Welcome to the Church Resource, where we talk about the best resources for pastors, leaders, and lay people. I'm your host, Jeff Oliver, and the book I am bringing to you today is called Counsel for Couples, a subtitle, A Biblical and Practical Guide for Marriage Counseling. It's by Jonathan D. Holmes, and a great book. I just want to start out by saying it's indispensable, one of the ones that I wish I had had, early on. In fact, it's one, let me just make a confession here. If you're one who has gathered a lot of books, whether you're a pastor or just an avid book collector, not necessarily reader, but if you have lots of books and even you have a couple of boxes that have survived multiple moves and not made it to your bookshelf just because of lack of space or whatever. This is one of those. I was in one of those boxes a couple of weeks ago, rummaging through there, found this gem, and again, one that I hadn't read yet. Was very happy to see it since my ministry context now is more overlapping with marriage and with counseling and coaching couples, and so that has it was wonderful for me to find this, a great find, and so I just want to heartily recommend this to you. Now, let me tell you why. Again, Jonathan Holmes is the author, and it has so many names that you would recognize, especially if you're coming from the people like from the Christian Counseling and Education Foundation, and they are, for example, one of the endorsements on the back of the book from Ed Welch, and you also find endorsements from David Powlison and from Ted Tripp and Paul Tripp. And so you'll see those in here. The one from Ed Welch, by the way, is he says, read this book cover to cover. It is useful immediately. Then keep it close as a handy reference tool. Totally agree with that. It's something that we need to have on our desks, maybe at least handy to a shelf that's very nearby. So the endorsements go on for a couple of pages, standouts in the world of counseling, of pastoring, of especially true biblical counseling, which I've made a distinction here before, is different from just Christian counseling that is kind of Bible flavored, but also just really true biblical counseling, where we're going to go and look at and be very different from what you'll find in secular counseling, from what you'll find in psychotherapy or any kind of psychiatry. What you'll find here is a biblical approach, and we're always going to go to the heart of the matter, not necessarily, well, it includes behavior, of course. It includes the things we say, the things we do, and the things we think. But it's going to go a lot deeper and look at the heart of a particular issue that you're dealing with in your life, in your marriage, in your business, or however you're going to approach that. In this particular one, we're talking about marriage. Counsel for Couples is laid out in a great way. I think that it's part one, the basics of counseling couples. Part two is the specific issues you will face in marriage counseling. I want to get to one of those in particular in just a moment. And part three, with only one chapter, we'll talk about that in just a little bit. It's called Caring for the Counselor. Very seldom, I think, do you look at a book that's going to talk about, okay, here's how we counsel this kind of situation, here's the background, here are some of the approaches and some of the specifics, and then I think it would just kind of cut off, or maybe a conclusion with, some last advice there for the couples that you're counseling, but not necessarily caring for the counselor, him or herself, and we'll talk about what that covers in a moment. But it is the basics of counseling couples, the first part, and it's going to get to, again, to the heart of the issue. So as a couple comes to you, how do we get to discovering what the real root causes of these issues are? How do we kind of look into their background somewhat? Because the background, although it's not something we can change, it's not something that usually true biblical counseling covers much at all, but it is something that certainly is going to characterize and influence the things that we think about today. Whatever happened to us in the past, whether it's trauma or something less serious, whatever it is, these patterns that we've developed are going to come forward and be magnified in a marriage. So one of the things that is one of the critiques that's usually leveled against biblical counseling, as opposed to even other forms of Christian counseling, is that maybe it doesn't get practical enough. What people say is that, well, it's just kind of ivory tower. It's a lot of a lot of scripture, which I'm not sure how that's a bad thing, but it doesn't get enough to where people live. It's very academic, and that kind of critique that's often given there. So what I think is done in this book, and I think in many resources that I've seen that are from that realm of true biblical counseling, is that yes, we're going to start with the heart. We're going to start with Scripture. We're going to unpack large portions of Scripture, not just proof texting by one or two verses here and there, and kind of putting that on a Post-it note over the issue that's going on and say, hey, this verse applies. But we're going to really delve into the Scriptures and find out deeply what the Scriptures say and how they interact, how they inform how we deal with, in this case, couples who are talking to us who want to get some counsel for their marriage. So again, this is several chapters here. First 6 chapters are going to be the basics of counseling couples, and again, they're going to talk about how to start your counseling experience with them, how to set expectations there. In other words, are we going to go for 10 weeks, or are we going to maybe have an out clause that as it becomes clear that we need to end this? Maybe it's because, and they address this very well in here, maybe it's because one of the counselees becomes belligerent. Maybe they make threats, and the author talks about some very specific instances where his life and his family's life was threatened. Okay, we need to end this relationship, and we may need to make a call to some authorities. Also, there might be instances of spouse abuse that also needs to be reported, but it needs to be an opportunity here to assess whether we need to go on, or we need to, in counseling, or we need to maybe stop this, put a pause right here, and really address that very serious, imminent problem that's going on in the case of abuse. So I think that was great, a good kind of an alert to us to see what's really important in in our considerations in counseling. And so also, when do we refer? I've always been taught that kind of you never really want to refer because it shows that, well, you have a weakness there, and it shows that you don't really know what you're talking about. Well, no, in fact, the thing is that the most loving thing you can do sometimes, if you're out of your depth as a counselor, you will need to go and refer to someone who is more experienced, who has dealt with maybe a particular issue more than you have. And you then have that opportunity to do a couple of things. You can still be in touch with that couple. You can still ask them, look, can I sit in on some of your sessions so that maybe I can be a bridge between you and the other counselor, but also so that I can learn from my own education. I can see how this counselor handles that situation, and then maybe I would be better equipped the next time. So I think it's a good thing. It's a loving thing to refer a couple to someone else, and then have that as a handover, very fluid, seamless transition over to that other counselor. It's good, and they discuss this here in this book. So one other thing is that they talk about how to structure the initial sessions. So what are we going to talk about? What I like about this book, and here's where we get practical, even in the first section that is they call it the basics of counseling couples. One thing is that they give lists, or rather he gives lists of very specific questions, things that you want to make sure that you address, things you want to make sure you kind of pull out that are hiding under the surface. And that happens all the time in counseling. They talk about the counseling being kind of addressing only the tip of the iceberg, where the rest of the iceberg, 90% of it is under the surface. Well, we need to kind of bring that up. We need to see what that is and understand what's going on there below the surface. So second section of this book, the part 2, is specific issues you will face in marriage counseling. I love the way these are handled, and I think that these are obviously some of the most serious, the most extreme examples, but unfortunately, some of the most common. They're things like adultery and pornography use and an unbelieving spouse. Talking about dissatisfaction. We talk about spouse abuse in another chapter. And another is where there's just a coldness and we don't communicate anymore. So how do we get past those issues? And then also the kids are not all right is the name of that chapter, when children have gone astray, and oftentimes that causes a real rift in marriage where one parent thinks, well, if we had just done it my way, or we made this problem early on, and I disagreed with it, but we went forward with it, and now our children have turned out this way, or if only. It's that kind of question, and we talk about that in this book. 3 other issues that are covered here are things like infertility and miscarriage, how to work through some of those things with a couple. Also, when intimacy is just frozen and there's nothing going on between husband and wife, that any kind of spark has just gone, and we talk about how to discuss that properly and appropriately with a couple. Also, we talk about that topic of the chapter is called In-Laws or Outlaws, and so how do we deal with extended family in this marriage situation? I told you I would look at one of these specifics, and I want to address the topic in the chapter that is on the idea of adultery. And this chapter, I think, has I pulled this one out because it has some very well done questions on how we want to deal with this situation as it comes up in the marriage, and so how we can move forward on that, because it is not the end. If both spouses are willing to work through it, if both spouses are willing to take the time and extend grace upon grace upon grace, I've seen this happen in couples. I've seen it turn out well, where the couples now are thriving. They're together. They're happy. They're together, and wouldn't think of ending their marriage over that situation. But I've seen them also, of course, that where adultery has just completely ended the marriage because the trust is gone, because someone is still standing somewhat defiantly in arrogance and wants to justify, wants to fight for his or her own way. And so I've seen that as well. So I love this. They go through, the author goes through scenarios here. He goes through and covers one particular story of a spouse. It's actually story after story of spouses who dealt with various aspects of infidelity. Maybe it was just an emotional affair. Maybe it was something that went all the way to physical intimacy with somebody else. And so there are factors and ingredients, he says, for infidelity. There are 5 Ds, very helpful. Disappointment. We dabble in that sin. Then we have found delight in that other person. We have denial when it comes to light, what has happened, and various ways that has happened in people he's counseled. Also discovery, and then despair. He talks about the initial steps in counseling and what we do to guard against this kind of thing happening again. Of course, so we need to address not just we don't talk to that person again. We don't have conversation with them. We don't try to see them anymore. It goes beyond that, because behavior, of course, is part of it, but we need to move past that, and we need to say that, so what is it in the heart that led you to do that? Is it some disappointment in your life? Is it some lack of fulfillment that is going on? And do you feel, is it maybe a depression that's setting in, and you reached out to find some comfort in someone else? And so we're really going to go deep again to find out how we can address the causes, the things that made you stumble, that made you step, baby steps, one by one, just little things that caused you to move into someone else's sphere and into their confidence, and into their arms. And so then we deal with, now we've talked about kind of the short term. These are the things we need to do. These are the guards we put up. These are the things we need to, as couples, down to the very specific, such as getting checked for your health, and making sure that that any kind of disease is found out and that it's treated if that needs to happen. Of course, that does happen in these cases. And then long-term care. How do we deal with forgiveness? How do we deal with the underlying factors of this? How do we rebuild trust in that relationship that has obviously been devastated? How do we start to regain that trust and confidence in each other where it's been placed in someone else? I think this is an excellent way to approach this. I think that it has been very helpful for me to understand if I were to be faced with a couple dealing with this, then it is a great place to go to get a handle on the ways to approach this, to do it graciously and lovingly, but thoroughly, to make sure that both couples are heard and they're addressed, and that they understand the way forward. Now, a couple of other things I'll point out about this book is that it has counselor field notes in the end of each chapter, and it's going to give you an idea from from a different one each chapter, from other counselors who have dealt with a particular problem that chapter addresses, and just a few paragraphs about something that they have done, some insight that they have on that kind of situation. Also, other chapters have some other stories that will talk about the particular couple who was dealt with. So those are two different features at the end of many of the chapters, one couple story and also counselor field notes. And then also, I love it when a book is well-resourced. This one certainly is. And at the end of each chapter, they'll tell you which books were consulted for that particular chapter. And then at the end, there is a wealth. You would spend a long, long time going through all these resources if this was something you were interested in and wanted to look at. For example, the headings for the resources are different biblical counseling organizations that you can look in and see what information and resources they would have. Also, biblical counseling blogs, favorite books on marriage, personal list from the author. Also, marriage retreats, small group curriculum that there are, some intensives that he knows about, also premarital counseling resources. This is an excellent source. Again, you need to keep it handy if you find people, as you will, who come to you and have some issue with husband or wife, and they need to work through this together. If they're looking to proceed forward with that person, or even if they're not, they need to come to you and talk about it, and then you can help them to understand the treasure that is their marriage, that God has designed for it, and to find them the marriage within the person they've already married, not somewhere else, but to find the marriage that other people will envy, the one marriage that they've always wanted. So again, this is Counsel for Couples, a biblical and practical guide for marriage counseling by Jonathan D. Holmes. Again, strongly recommend this. Get it today. So that's just one of my books that has been helpful to me throughout my ministry. I want to say books on my shelf, but it's a book that was in a box in the garage. So, but now it's on my shelf. So I hope this helps you and gives you a bit of direction as you prayerfully consider which resources will best help you and the people you minister to. Thanks for listening to the Church Resource, and make sure that you give us a review if you have any questions or that you have about any of the books that we've reviewed here. If you have any suggestions or resources that you would like us to look at, just email us at thechurchresource@gmail.com.